Hello everybody, welcome back to Chess Openings Explained. I'm your instructor tonight, Nick Risko, one of the instructors here at the St. Louis Chess Club. And we're going to be going over the Sicilian Defense, the pin variation tonight. And I gotta be honest, I was a little in over my head for this one. I thought it was going to be super easy to prepare. I thought, this line isn't supposed to be great for black, but it's important for white to know what to do. And when I went looking for resources to study for this, one of our own videos popped up a long time ago, before I started working here, by Grandmaster Yasser Seirawan. And I watched that lecture and I was like, oh yeah, he's just going to beat the pin variation. Turns out, Yasser loves the pin variation. He played it a lot in scholastics, and I realized the real challenge for this week was I have to refute a grandmaster. So let's get into it. We're going to be going over the pin variation of the Sicilian Defense. Starts off with pawn to e4 and pawn to c5. This is the Sicilian. And knight f3. So knight f3 by white will lead to the open variations. Most commonly, there are sometimes we play knight c3 and try and go into like a, I guess like a King's Indian attack with g3. But more often than not, it's going to lead to an open Sicilian. And here in the pin variation, black is going to play pawn to e6. Normally, you might see pawn to d6 or knight to c6, but e6 is also playable. And here, white normally goes d4, opening up the position. Black should capture. The idea is you're giving up a flank pawn for a center pawn at the cost of development. White will have a very nice knight here on d4, but black has an extra center pawn. And here, black goes knight to f6. There are other variations where they can go a6 or queen c7 first. This will lead to the Khan or Taimanov Paulsen systems. But tonight we're going to look at knight to f6 and knight to c3. Here, black can still transpose into the other systems by playing a6, queen c7, or knight c6, but tonight's main focus is the pin variation, and that is bishop to b4. What is the point of this move? The point is that black is going to be putting increased pressure on the pawn on e4. If white is not careful and they play something like bishop e2 trying to develop normally, there's bishop c3, pawn c3, and knight e4, and white is already down a pawn. Okay, so back to this position. After knight to c3, I should mention some of the other moves that white can play, or rather why white shouldn't play these moves. Probably the most common one you'll see at a scholastic level is pushing the pawn to e5 right away, and this one is a mistake. I'll give the chat 10 seconds to try and find the move. Shouldn't be too difficult. See some compliments for Yasser in the chat. Yasser's a great guy, but I can't think like that for this lecture. I have to think, this guy knows nothing about chess. I need to beat him in this line that he that he covered. So here we see in the chat, emblazoned was first, queen to a5 check, hitting the king, hitting the pawn. It's a fork. After knight to c3 to block, queen e5, and black is better. They are just up a pawn very comfortably. Not much counterplay white can get from this. You have to block with the bishop and then castle kingside and just hope that you can get play with your pieces later. It should be noted, blocking with queen may not be the best because queen takes on d4. So e5, mistake by white. So if you're playing this with black, there are some tricks very early on. Now what happens if white plays bishop to d3? Maybe they notice, hey, the knight is attacking the pawn. There are some systems where going bishop to d3 first may actually be useful, where if instead of going knight to f6, black may consider going to a6 first, bishop d3 can actually be fine here. Same against queen to c7. Going bishop to d3 is not the worst move in the world and can transpose to a Maroczy bind. But here against knight f6, and bishop d3, the position is a little bit different. Now after knight to c6, your knight on d4 is hit and it's hanging, so you have to do something about it. And probably the best way for white to deal with this is just trade it off. Once you trade it off, black will capture with the b pawn, and after castles, black hits you with d5 and should be fine here. I don't think I would go as far as to say black is completely better, but they survive the opening. So bishop d3 may not be the best move in this line. Okay, so if bishop d3 doesn't work, what if you try another kind of weird looking move, knight to d2? You're blocking your queen and your bishop, so not very recommended, but let's see what exactly is wrong with this move. After knight to d2, black has the flexible pawn to d6, and you get black playing a Scheveningen Sicilian, where it's very flexible, and normally white can follow up with g4, but here you want to make sure you are developing your pieces, protecting your center, because after bishop to d3, black just has some very comfortable development here. Knight b to d7, and once you castle, black has this pretty cool move, knight c5, and it seems a little strange at first. You're moving the same piece more than once in the opening, and you're only on move 7. But the idea is that now white almost has to give up this bishop for the knight. And normally, that's going to be a good exchange for black, giving up a knight for one of the bishops. So, knight to c3 is the preferred move. There hasn't been any really weird moves by black here that will give us problems like the other moves do. And knight c3 invites the bishop to come to b4. And in Yasser's lecture, he said knight c3 was required for white to dream of having an advantage. At least there, I think we can agree. Now here after bishop to b4, like I said, the issue is with our e-pawn. So what should we do with this pawn? How do we get rid of this pressure? How can we continue without losing a pawn? Some players might choose knight to b5. And here knight to b5 is okay. Black can hit you with pawn to d5 and break in the center right away. And then you can play like e5, get the knight to move to e4. And then the only move here that white really has is queen to g4. I think this is the only move where they can get a solid advantage. If you can even call it that, it's still pretty equal after g6. But this is a try for white. I don't think it's the best try white has, though. Let's see, another move that they have here, instead of knight to b5, is bishop to d3. Again, trying to protect the pawn. And here, it also doesn't really seem like white is going to have a great time here after knight to c6. Again, the knight is hanging, so you have to do something about it. You can take, and black takes with the pawn. Now you play pawn to e5, knight to d5, hitting the knight twice. It is pinned. And here, bishop d2 is fine. It will lead to an equal game. There's only one move here where computer's saying white will have an advantage, and that's with queen to g4, hitting the pawn on g7, putting pressure on the bishop on b4, and here it's saying white is going to be fine. Again, I don't think this is going to be the best try for white. I think white has more that's possible for them to get out of this position. After something like g6, castles, pawn to h5 attacking the queen already. While black's pieces aren't perfect, the pawns are really strange, all on the white squares, so this light square bishop is going to probably struggle in the future. Black's at least getting some play hitting the queen. A move like queen to c4 makes sense. Now the bishop has to go back to e7 because of the threat of taking on d5 with the knight and removing the defender of the bishop. So after bishop to e7, knight e4, looking to go into f6 or d6, and pawn a5. This position should be better for white, but we're going to look at what's probably a better continuation. I think the only other move here that's worth looking at is bishop to e2, and after bishop to e2, There is bishop takes c3, bc3, and knight e4, or even just knight e4 first, and white is going to be down a pawn, but up the development. I wouldn't recommend this. I don't like the idea of white just giving up the pawn. So after looking at all those alternatives, all those other candidate moves, I should go into what the actual move is, and that is pawn to e5. If you're looking like you're going to lose a pawn, if there's no good way to defend it, always consider moving it. So pawn to e5. What exactly is happening here? Well, you're hitting the knight, and it's inviting the knight to come to d5 or e4. And there is a third move that we're going to cover tonight, just because it's an old line, a little tricky, but it's just completely losing for black. We'll cover that move first. That move is queen to a5, trying to put another attacker on c3, ignoring the threat on f6, maybe threatening to capture on e5, but let's just see how white gets out of this. First, you take the knight. This was the entire point of playing e5. So ef6, bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, and queen takes c3, and it looks like black is going to win a rook and get their material back. Now here, there's two obvious candidate moves. The one that most people may fall for is bishop to d2. They say, my rook is obviously more important than the knight. The rook is worth more than the knight. I should save the rook. But after bishop to d2, queen takes d4. If you take on g7, then queen takes g7, and this is a relatively equal position. White may have some trouble getting this light square bishop out in the future because g2 is being hit. So this one, black should not be struggling too much for. They can play pawn to d6, get their light square bishop out on d7 and c6. So instead of playing bishop to d2 here, they should play queen to d2. And here's the idea. Queen takes the rook. This was the threat. But now the pawn takes on g7, forcing black to go rook to g8. Otherwise, you're going to either take the rook or just push and make a queen. And the key move here is pawn to c3. And once we take a look at this position, we ask ourselves, what is happening with black's queen? And you start realizing, well, the queen doesn't really have any squares to go to. It can't go to b2, can't go to c3, can't go to a2. Those are all protected by the queen. The only square it can go to is b1. So let's say we try and go queen b1, trying to get out, maybe go queen to b6. Well, there is bishop to d3, and after queen to b6, this position should just be winning for white because of the development of the pieces. You're going to castle next. Black has done nothing to develop their queen side. And here it should just be winning. There's no great continuation for black after bishop to a3. The bishop is probably looking to go to f8, just protect the pawn, and then the only way to break it up is to sacrifice a rook for a bishop and a pawn. If they try to take on g7 right away, there's always queen h6 attacking the rook. And once the rook moves back, you have queen h7 hitting the rook again. Rook is actually trapped in this position. Let's see, I believe there was another move played instead of queen to b6, or sorry, rather instead of like bishop to a3, there are a couple queen moves as well that have been played in actual games. The move queen h6 right away was played in the game Kriviashvili versus Paksashvili in Desin in 1996. And the continuation was queen to c5, castles, queen to e5, again trying to get something happening with this queen. But knight b5 looking to go into c7 or d6 if this queen moves. Knight to a6 protecting against any knight to c7 fork. Bishop to g5, queen takes g7, knight d6, king f8, and now queen h5. Not looking to trade the queens. The idea is that bishop h6 is coming, and there's no way to protect against bishop h6 while also keeping your queen on f7, preventing mate. Another move instead of queen h6 is queen to g5. And this is more played than queen h6, but I think queen h6 is probably more accurate. Now there's queen d8 looking to trade off the queens, and here is actually a good idea because bishop g5 comes with check, and after the king moves, bishop f6 will hold on to this pawn forever. And it's just going to be hard for black to ever get rid of this passed pawn. It's always going to be one move away from promoting. So back to the main line, I think queen a5 is just losing. You just have to remember that after you take the knight, when they take on c3 with the queen, you should play queen to d2 and give up the rook. And you just have to remember to play pawn to c3. So queen a5 busted. Okay, the other move black can think of, or I guess two moves, is knight to d5 and knight to e4. We will cover knight to e4 first because I think this is the worst option due to queen to g4. And the queen is hitting the knight and the pawn on g7. And white should get a better position here after queen g4. What are the follow-ups for black? Well, let's start with queen to a5. Some of the same ideas, just piling up on c3. But here there is queen takes g7, and you're threatening the rook. The main move here is, rook to f8. After bishop h6, you have this threat to take on f8 if this bishop ever goes. Knight takes on c3 is a move here, and white has this little move, pawn to a3. The idea is that once this knight moves away, you capture on b4. It's the piece that's checking you. So knight to c6, developing another piece instead, makes a lot of sense. Knight to b3, hitting the queen. Queen takes e5. It's forking the king and queen, so you have to take. The knight takes. Now after ab4, this knight moves back to safety, threatening the pawn. Bishop takes f8, king takes f8, and after all those moves, white emerges up an exchange. So rook f8. Now, what if instead of rook f8, black tries to give this check first? Get rid of the bishop with check. Well, here you just take on you take with the b pawn on c3, and after the queen takes back, the very important move here, king to e2. King to e2 is winning for white. The other move, king to d1, is actually winning for black because you're just giving up this knight with check, and then they're going to follow up with knight f2. Say bishop d3, knight f2, you're losing a rook. So you have to remember to go to e2, and if the queen takes the knight, then your queen takes on h8 with check. And you're allowed to do this because they didn't capture with check on d4. Your king was out of the way on e2. So here, same idea. If they take your rook, you just take their rook with check with a winning position. So the move that black should elect to play here is rook to f8. And again, we're going to go bishop to h6, threatening to take. And now queen c5. You have to protect this rook. And white will play knight to b3, hitting the queen. The knight was also attacked. So knight to b3 makes sense. Now this does allow the scary-looking queen to f2. After queen to f2, you can play king to d1, and your bishop and knight control the mating square. This kind of idea was also seen in the copycat variation of the Vienna game, which we also did a lecture on a few weeks ago, where black will get this, queen to f2 checking the king, and it looks very scary because it looks like you're getting mated. But when you look at this position, you actually ask yourself, what threats does black have? And black doesn't have any threats. And even though black has delivered these scary-looking checks, they don't have a way to protect the rook on f8. And now it is black's turn to run the king around the board. So you have to move the king to d8 so it can go to c7, or you have to push the pawn to get an escape square. But either way, the queen is going to take on f8 with check. And then the king is going to run to his escape square. And then after something like bishop to d3 hitting the knight, your rook is ready to come to f1, maybe snap f7 off the board. White's just actually very safe here. So let's go back. That is with the knight to e4 line. And like I said, queen g4 should be good for you, and that was against the queen a5 line here. There's also, if black chooses to take on c3 with the knight. And here you cannot take on c3 because of bishop c3, and it is a fork with the king and rook. So here, if you can't take on c3, what should you do? You have to make a bigger threat. You have to go queen takes g7, attacking the rook. And now, if the knight moves anywhere, if it goes like back to d5, you have pawn to c3 blocking the check. And now the queen is also hitting h8. You can't protect both. White will emerge fine. There's just too much pressure here on the rook. Again, if they try and go like rook to f8, there's always bishop to h6 to add this pressure, threatening to win the exchange. In this specific position, though, taking the bishop first is going to be better because bishop h6 is always going to be a resource. So this knight to e4 idea, I don't think is going to be working out for black. If they play rook f8 first, this was seen in the game Sabo versus Mikanas in Khmeri 1939. Sabo is both of these players are very strong GMs for their time. And Sabo actually ended up playing in the very strong Zurich 1953 candidates tournament. So Mikanas plays rook to f8, and Sabo continues with pawn to a3. Now when the knight moves, you can just take on b4. You can just take the piece that's checking you. You give up the knight on d4 and follow up with bishop to g5 hitting the queen. Queen has to move, and now you get the thematic bishop h6. Queen takes b4 check. You block with c3, which is also a fork. Knight goes to f5 hitting the queen. C takes b4, knight takes g7, bishop g7, rook g8, and now bishop f6. And white has a fantastic position here. The bishop is protected by the pawn, so this bishop is always going to be kind of paralyzing black's center here. It's going to be a little hard for black to push this d pawn, and black still has not developed anything on the queen side. So I couldn't find any real move after queen to g4 that would give black a real good shot at equality. Which leaves us with the main line. Knight to d5. Knight to d5 is the best move here. Probably the only move where black can hope to have an advantage at any point. And here, there are quite a few moves. Quite a few moves here for white. Knight to b5 is obviously one that deserves consideration. Looking to go to d6, and this should be fine, but I think this is going to be more equal, give black more hope. They have pawn to a6 hitting the knight, and after knight d6, there's take, take, and knight takes c3, and after the b pawn takes on c3, white has not prevented black from doubling the pawns, so this can be a long-term weakness. Black can end up, actually, I think my analysis for this line ends here, sorry. After b takes c3, just white hasn't prevented the doubling of the pawns, which gives black some long-term targets. One of the benefits is that you do have this pawn on d6 that kind of freezes black's center. So knight b5 does deserve consideration. I think the other move, I guess the other serious contender, and this is the move that Yasser recommended white to play in his video, was queen to g4. Yasser also made the claim that this is the only good move. I do agree this move is good for white. Let's say black decides to play castle to defend the pawn. There is bishop to h6, threatening mate in 1. The only way to defend this is pawn to g6, and you can win an exchange on f8. So now white is up material. The problem is this pin on c3 is still really annoying. So you have to play queen to g3 in this position to help defend. You can also try knight to e2. It's another interesting idea. You do block your light square bishop, but after like knight to c6, you have queen g3 and you're still doing all right. But I would just recommend playing queen g3 first. And now queen to c5. You always see black trying to put more and more pressure on c3. Very thematic, because this is the entire idea of the variation. It's why it's called the pin variation. You pin the knight, you try and win something on c3. And now knight e2 is going to be your best move because it does bring in another defender. Knight to c6, bringing this knight into the game. Just castle queenside. Now this can look very scary. Not going to lie to you there. Black does have 4 pieces on the queen side, and white only has, you know, a rook and 2 knights, and their king is over here. But there's, if you look at where black's pieces are pointing, all the threats are on c3. It's not really going to be on the king on the back row. Knight to c3, knight to c3, queen e5. So this lets black win the e-pawn. And in the MCO 15, and if you look at the database, but specifically MCO 15, Nick DeFermian says, you know, once black wins the e-pawn, gives black almost equal chances. d5 here, and we enter this weird position where white does have the rook for the bishop, but black does have this nice pawn center, which does give some compensation, not to mention the bishop pair. So this endgame is probably going to be one of the best positions black can hope for, at least from the analysis that I've done. This is probably going to be black's best hope. The other idea that black has after queen g4 instead of castling is playing king to f8. It looks weird because you're not castling, but the idea is that you're not really going to be allowing bishop to h6 threatening mate in 1, because you can just take the bishop. So here, white is just going to have to play something like bishop to d2, break this pin, and black can kind of open up the position after pawn to d6. You'll see pawn takes on d6, and instead of taking back right away, because black is always going to have queen takes d6, you will see them take on c3 first, and white will capture with the pawn. Black has given white the opportunity to get the bishop pair. It wouldn't make much sense for white to capture with the bishop just to get rid of that advantage. And with these doubled pawns on the board, it also makes sense for white to just keep an extra set of pieces on the board, so that way white has more to work with. So now queen takes d6, and then like bishop d3 here, and not many games go down this line, but black should be aware that this is an idea, and white should also be aware that like king f8 is a real move. So queen to g4 is probably one of the better moves for white. It's probably the second best. So we looked at knight b5 in this position. We ended up looking at queen to g4, but now this is where I'm going to go away from what Yasser mentioned in his video. And I am going to recommend the move bishop to d2. And in Yasser's video, he was saying, you know, after bishop to d2, this shouldn't really be great for white because there is still chances for black to double white's pawns. However, I don't think that in this move order is going to be such a big deal. There's quite a few moves here. So let's see, after bishop to d2, what does black have? I should mention, let's actually take a look first at knight to c6. I actually gave this move a double question mark, and I want to see if chat can figure out the idea of why knight to c6, a very natural looking move, might be a problem here. I'll give you guys about a minute here. See if you can find why knight c6 may not be the best move for black. Looking in the chat here, Knight Riders asking if we can do a video on the Grand Prix and the Petrov defense. Yeah, so those, I think we actually may have a short video on the Petrov. If we haven't, I need to get in touch with Danny to make sure we can get that happening. But we do have material for the Petrov that is prepped, and I am experimenting with the Grand Prix. I've never played it too seriously, so I want to make sure I can get familiar with it before I give a lecture on it. Musa Tuweni is recommending queen to h5. I don't know if queen to h5 is going to be the move here. After queen to h5, you just hang your knight on d4. So not really sure what you're getting out of here. Stefan is recommending knight takes d5, but Stefan, can you please explain why knight takes d5 would be good? Anxiety Squid is recommending bishop to b5, pinning the knight on c6, but this is not an actual pin. This pawn is still on d7, so this knight is pinned to nothing. It can still take on d4, and you're going to be down a knight. Schuler is saying white gets access to d6, and this is the idea. So couple that idea with Stefan's knight takes d5. White should actually just get a positionally winning position. After knight takes d5, bishop takes d2, queen d2, e d5, and now white gets either knight to b5 or knight to f5, but either way, that knight is going to get to d6, and this square, d6, is a permanent outpost for the knight. There are no pawns on the c and e files to kick the knight away. So this knight's going to go to d6. It's going to be a very strong piece. It'll be very annoying for black to deal with. I have to remove like castles and knight d6. With this knight also blocking the d-pawn, it's going to be even more difficult for black to successfully develop this bishop on c8. I should mention that putting the knight on d6 is not to get the bishop on c8. This knight on d6 is way better than this bishop that can't go anywhere and has no influence on the position. So knight to d6 is the idea. Now, if you try something like, knight takes c6, this is going to get rid of your positional advantage. Black just takes with their d-pawn, and suddenly what looked pretty difficult for black space-wise and development-wise actually looks great. They now have this fantastic pawn chain into the center. Their bishop is open to develop to a square of its choosing. They're ready to castle. Queen is able to get out. Just this position is so much better for black than what it was a move ago. So do not take on c6. If you don't want to go knight f5 right away, this idea still lingers for a few moves. You have an idea of castling first. This is doable. But black gets to castle. And then now, let's see. I think the one problem with knight takes d4 to eliminate this idea of the knight getting to d6 is after the queen takes, there's no way to protect d5, so you'll win a center pawn. So you'll see a move like castles, and then white should continue knight to b5, again going to d6. And the reason why I would suggest b5 in this situation is in case the queen moves anywhere, it's not going to go to g5. But if the queen moves anywhere, you do have knight c6 hitting the rook as well. But I think either square should be fine. Even if the knight takes on e5, you can still go knight d6, and then your queen is going to take on d5 in the very near future. So I see Super Pomax was just mentioning why can't black play knight takes e5, and they still can. It's just white will still get the knight to d6, and then this pawn on d5 is going to hang. So very good question. Okay, so knight to c6 looked like it would be a natural move, looked like it would be fine. You're hitting a hanging piece, but this is just positionally losing. So what other options does black have? Black does have the option of taking on c3 with the bishop. And here, pawn takes on c3 and queen c7. And I believe this is the line Yasser gave as to why bishop d2, may be a poor choice because black is threatening both of these pawns. However, there is a strong move, pawn to f4. The idea with pawn to f4 is you're still keeping your lines open for your pieces, but then you're going to use this pawn on f4, hopefully to break into black's position. There are a couple ideas here, but let's see if black goes for the most direct knight takes c3. Well, now there's queen to f3. You're hitting the knight, threatening to win it, and after knight to d5, white is going to be fine after knight to b5, and again, the knight is going to get to d6, and here white just has a crushing position. If they don't take on c3, they can try castling. Castling is an option for black, and here white can get away with just natural development, bishop to d3, and let's say the knight takes on c3, again trying to punish white for not protecting this pawn enough. There is queen to h5 now, threatening mate in 1. g6 is the only move to defend, and queen to h6. Maybe the idea is going to be h4, h5, rip open the h-file. Maybe you're going to hope for pawn to f5 and get away with bishop g5 to f6. That's a bit of a long plan, though. Black does get some play with pawn to d6, but taking will hit the queen. The queen recaptures. Or just queen goes to c5 rather. You don't want to give up the knight, so recapturing is actually just a blunder. You hang a piece. So you'll see queen to c5. And now this knight on f3 is going to reroute itself, from d4 to f3, and is going to go to g5, where now white is going to be threatening h7, and there's no good way to defend. So castles is also going to lead to a very strong attack for white. Okay, so that's if the bishop takes first. Now the main line here, instead of giving up the bishop, is to take on c3 with the knight. And here is going to be black's best try. It is very important that white remembers to take on c3 with the pawn. Now, this is the point that black is trying to make, is that white has to double these pawns to get a very good advantage. The problem with taking with the bishop is that bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, and you're met with queen to c7 that is forking your pawns. And because you haven't developed your queen yet, there is no queen to g3 to protect both. And this will lead to a better position for black. So you need to remember, take on c3 with the pawn, do not take with the bishop. And now here, black is met with a choice. Where do they put this dark square bishop? It's being attacked, so you can't just leave it there. What are the options here for black? There's probably two good options here. But there is one option, bishop a5, which I do want to cover. I do not think this is the best line. You're met with queen to g4, hitting this weak g7 pawn, a theme that we've been seeing throughout the night. You have to castle to protect it. If you try something like king to f8, it's still playable, but white just brings in the pawn to h4, going to just run this pawn up the board, try and break up the pawn structure. So castle's the most played. Bishop to d3, hitting h7. So again, just bringing more pieces into the attack on the king side. You might see pawn to d6. We saw this in one of the other lines where black is trying to open up the position a little bit. But here again, we will see a knight maneuver to bring the knight into the attack. Knight f3. Now, if you take, it can be a bit dangerous. There's actually a Greek gift here where white can take on h7, and after king takes, you have knight g5 or queen h5, but I'm looking at knight g5 because that seems to be the most most common way people will recognize the Greek gift. And then wherever the king goes, they're going to either get mated or white is going to win a severe amount of material. So black needs to be careful after knight to f3 because there are the bishops on d2 and d3, a queen on g4. Greek gifts do exist, so the best way to deal with this is just play pawn to g6. And now we have this kind of fianchetto pawn structure. and the best way to counter those is run your h-pawn up the board. D takes e5 here, and there is no Greek gift because g6 was played. But now white has pawn to h5. Now, best move for black here, surprisingly, is pawn to f5, hitting the queen. So you don't get away with taking on g6, but you do get away with a bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes f5, and what is the point? If ef, then you have queen c4 check. The king, if it moves, is going to run into a lot of trouble after the h-pawn takes on g6. You can't really take back because of bishop h6 winning an exchange right off the bat, and some mate threats if you just move the king. Move the king back, that is, to the h-file. So this can lead to some problems if black moves the king. That's why you will see them block with the rook. And this is still going to lead to a very crushing attack by white. After this h-file opens, the knight is going to come to g5. It's protected by the bishop, so no queen takes. Queen c7 looking to trade the queens. And now as long as white doesn't trade the queens, they will be fine. Queen to h4, and this position was reached in the game Wagman-Barl and Biel 1981. Stockfish gives it an evaluation of like plus 20. So bishop a5, a little inaccurate, leaving the king side pretty weak. So you will see other moves here. Bishop to f8 is one move. And here white plays bishop to d3. This is going to be fine. This may be the best try for black, is bishop to f8, though it seems very impractical to do so, because when you look at black's pieces, it looks like black's setting up for the next game. Black is just going to be so far down in development that it's hard to imagine that they're going to launch an attack to win. But this position does seem fairly balanced, so I do have to say bishop to f8 does look pretty good for black. However, the most played move is bishop e7, and this is the main line. So this is what we're going to be covering for the rest of the lecture, is bishop to e7. And here, white gets the move queen to g4. Again, just hitting this g7 pawn. Hopefully it's sticking by now that if black has not castled, you do have queen g4 as a strong threat. Now, there are three different moves here for black. I think we will start off with king to f8. King to f8 is a move here. Bishop to d3, your standard development, bringing in the other piece. And now pawn to h5, trying to hit the queen. So I will say, you know, black does have some tricks they can go for. Hitting the queen with h5 is one of them. But after something like queen to f4, keeping it lined up with the king, maybe looking to play bishop g6 soon. You'll see black play pawn to d6. Here, bishop to g6 works. Now queen to e8 to defend. Knight to f3, and the knight is going to try and go to g5. Or, if allowed, white is going to take on d6 and then play knight e5. So to stop this idea of taking a knight e5, black plays pawn to d5. And here, I think white just has a very comfortable position. You can play pawn to h4 to kind of freeze this h-pawn, and also to get away with knight g5. You can't play it right away because bishop takes g5, and when you take back, the bishop on g6 hangs. So I do want to mention this. So, okay, king f8 seems a little slow. It looks like they're just trying to catch up to the defense. The other move we should look at here is pawn to g6. I thought this was going to be black's best try. If it's not going to be bishop to f8 on the previous move, pawn to g6 does give some work for white to do to get an advantage. But we're going to go knight to b5, looking to go to d6. You'll see with this pawn on e5 all the way from the very beginning makes it very hard for black just to push this d-pawn. And if this d-pawn is still on d7, knight to d6 is always going to be some idea. Black does castle here, and pawn to h4. You can try going bishop to h6, but this is going to lead to more of an equal position if black is willing to give up the exchange. Knight to c6, and now black is going to start catching up in some of the development that they've been lacking this entire time. If they do go rook to e8, this is still going to be better for white after pawn to h4, and this attack is going to be very strong. So you just have to be willing to give up this exchange, because after bishop takes f8, you have bishop takes f8, and now if h4, you have like knight takes e5, and you're hitting the queen, and it's really hard for the queen just to find a way in without the support of the bishop on the dark squares. Okay, so pawn to g6 and then bishop h6 is an idea, but the best idea for white here is just h4 right away. Now knight to c6, hitting the e5 pawn. You should probably protect this pawn. Pretty important center pawn. It's what's preventing black from breaking open in the center. So after queen g3, there are two ideas for black. We'll start with one that I think is suboptimal, is pawn to a6. And now we see knight to d6, which was the idea of knight to b5 in the first place. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen a5. Getting the queen out, looking for some activity, is met with pawn to h5. The queen cannot take because of the rook. The pawn cannot take because of the pin. We will see queen e5 check, queen takes e5, knight takes e5, captures on g6, f captures on g6, and a4. Now, while white's pawns are not fantastic, I had to be honest there. The pawns are looking worse than black's. White does have the bishop pair, and for now has stopped any potential pawn play black may have here. This bishop on c8 is still going to be very difficult to develop. You're going to have to play like b6 and then bishop to b7, but this is pretty passive. It can be met with rook to b1, and b6 is already being hit. So after bishop to b7, rook takes b6, you're losing a pawn here for the bishop. And I don't like to be the guy that has to give up my material just so I can get my pieces to work properly. So I don't really recommend the a6 move, as it just lets white go through with their plan. I think if black has any chance at surviving this position, it should be with the move f6. And now I'm defying another grandmaster. For those who know Ben Feingold, never play f6. I think black has to play f6 here in order to survive. So ef, bishop takes f6, bishop h6 hitting the rook, and here black again has to be comfortable giving away the exchange. If they try something like rook f7, they're just going to be met with pawn to h5, and this g6 pawn is going to be captured. You can try playing g5. This is one of the ideas of giving up the f pawn, is that way once white clears this out, there is after h5, pawn to g5. Where did I just go in my notes? h5, g5. Okay, knight d6, hitting bishop, hitting rook. If you go rook to e7 here, white can develop their final piece with the bishop to b5 move. Pawn to a6, hitting the bishop. You just trade on c6 and castles. And here we see a very interesting case of what looks to be zugzwang. What move does black play here? There's no great move. White is +7 according to Stockfish 13. I hate giving the engine eval like that because it seems like I'm just spitting off engine lines, but it's just there for a reference so you guys can understand how serious this position is. So rook to f7 trying to save the rook is just going to jumble up black's pieces, no good defense. They do have to be okay giving up the exchange and should play something like pawn to a6. And here, the only move where white gets a serious advantage is bishop takes f8, queen takes f8, or ab5. Queen takes f8, the knight can just go to d4, and you save your knight. If they take on b5, then your bishop is safe. It can go to h6. It's really up to black which piece gets to come off of the board. They can try queen to a5, hitting the pawn, and this can be a little dangerous because they do have the bishop here, don't forget. So you bring your bishop back to d2, you defend the pawn in time, and after pawn to b4, trying to add a third attacker, you actually have this cute little move, rook to h3, bringing in another defender. And after pawn to d5, trying to give some squares for the bishop, white does have a nice healthy advantage here as well after pawn to h5. Just keeping up with these general attacking ideas. So I think this is another position where black can survive. It's not like white has this huge crushing advantage. Black should go e5 here, and the position is like +1.5, so it's manageable, but black does have some threats to deal with. So let's go back. We'll go back. That was the g6 line. If you're not going to play king f8, if you're not going to play g6, you better play the main line with castles. And here, I'm sure everyone's starting to get the idea now. The main move here is bishop to h6, threatening mate in 1. Only one response is g6, and here, white can take the rook right away. And then bishop captures. You can just win the exchange like this and then just be happy you're up material and play from there. That's fine. But white has better. White has better targets, or bigger targets than the rook. They want to go for an onslaught against the king. So, back to the rest of our attacking ideas. We see pawn to h4 again. Again, trying to go to h5, capture on g6, really rip open the king side, and make black kind of regret that the bishop's on e7 and they didn't play some other, move order to get something like a dragon with the bishop on g7. Pawn to h4 going for this attack, and black will normally try queen to a5, forking the pawns. But here, like I mentioned earlier, once this queen is developed, you have queen to g3 protecting both of the pawns. And black will normally try pawn to d6. The idea behind pawn to d6 here is you really just need squares to develop your pieces. Either your knight or your bishop can go to d7. Your knight also has the option of going to c6, but you really need to develop the queen side as fast as you can. This is going to be the main problem black faces, is just a lack of development on the queen side because they need to respond to all the threats on the king side. And here, a move that may not look so natural, but we've seen the idea before, is knight to b5. This will kind of overprotect the pawn on c3. It's also looking to just capture on d6 and maybe go to c7, trapping the rook if black's not careful and moves their queen. We will see a knight develop to d7, finally getting those pieces moving, but white is just so quick on the attack. They have pawn to h5. Black's best move is probably going to be captures on e5 here. And now white should just go ahead with the attack. The game where this line looks like it originated from was Zarnoda versus Sulkis in Warsaw 2005, and white elected to play pawn to f4, which is still fine, but it gives black a little hope if they see a6. After pawn to a6, both knights are being threatened, so fe5, ab5, and this position, white is just a little bit better after takes on g6, but after fg6, this rook does have an open file now, and black starts to get play with his pieces. You have to take on f8. After bishop f8, the only move here for white is like queen to h3 or rook to h3. And either of those may be a little difficult to find over the board. Queen h3 is a little more realistic, but h6 will hold the position. And while white is a little bit better here, this is not as clean as it could be. The move that was played in that game after f4 was bishop to d7, trying to hit the knight. And after fe5, bishop b5, White was able to trade off another set of pieces, which probably doesn't help black. Black needs the pieces to generate counterplay. And now after bishop to f8, White ended up winning this game after material was traded off, ended up winning some endgame. But like I said, I don't think f4 is going to be the best way to play against this knight takes e5 move. I believe the best way is going to be taking on g6 and just continuing this brute force attack. So h takes g6, f takes g6 makes a lot of sense. The rook is open, and now, only now, should White take the rook. Now that this file is open, the rook is actually doing something. It looks good on f8. Now makes sense to snap it up off the board. You're able to leave it sitting there for quite a while because of the mate threats. But now once this rook is actually doing something, it makes sense to capture because your opponent's rook is behaving like a rook. So now bishop takes f8. And the move I decided to choose here for White was rook to d1, just adding pressure onto the center. The queen would go to b6. The idea, just going to b6 and then defending d6. Queen to h3, hitting h7 like before. And now h6 doesn't really do the job after knight takes d6. This bishop is overloaded. So after bishop d6, there's queen to h6. And black is going to have some very big problems here. There's nothing defending the king. So h6 does not do the job where it did in the other line. They have to play h5, where now this backwards pawn is the only defender of the h-pawn. And here, White has bishop to e2, completing the development. This knight is adding pressure on d6, the rook's adding pressure. The queen and rook are doubled on the h file, but this bishop wasn't really doing anything. So bishop to e2, and now you're actually looking on your next move to play a very fun sacrifice. Bishop to d7, attacking the knight. If you don't do anything too great, you're just going to lose a piece on b5. So here you have a couple moves. Knight to d4 looks to be one of the better ones, but the move that is my favorite in this position is bishop takes h5. The idea is that after they take on h5, you play queen takes h5. You're already threatening mate in 1 with queen to h7. Bishop g7 is the only move to stop this, this huge queen h7 check. And now after bishop to g7, black has removed a defender of d6, and you can snap it with the knight. And Stockfish 13 at depth 30 gives this position an evaluation of +4. Even though like throughout the position it's saying it's only +2, you let it think for a little while, White's just crushing here. And it's very hard to see what black could have done better other than playing some weird moves. So I think this line's probably going to be the most instructive for White in how to handle this position, but I do want to clarify that there is the move bishop to f8 very early on after b captures. Bishop to f8 does look like it gives black chances, but because there's so many ways black can try and develop here, I believe it's just very hard to cover them all because it's like black is just starting a new game. They've reset their pieces. But White should still have a very healthy advantage after bishop d3, just up in development, and black's targets will appear naturally later on. But those are the lines that I prepared for you guys tonight. This was the Sicilian pin variation. I'm going to open up just our last couple minutes here. We don't have as many minutes as usual, but I do want to open it up to the chat. If you guys have any questions on any line you saw here, drop it in the chat. Please add a move number and a variation. That way I can be more helpful in knowing what line you're talking about. But if there are any questions, now's the time. Get them in. I'm going to scroll through the chat, make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. Let's see. Pin the knight with b5. We covered that. Wasn't a real pin. Let's see. d6 is an outpost. Hey, buddy. Hi, Nick. Hi, buddy. I don't know who you are, but hi. A little off topic, but some traps to learn. I believe there's a book. It's like, what, 700 opening traps? Or something like that. It goes over all these really quick miniatures. I believe the author's Bill Wall. I could be very wrong on that. But if you're interested in traps, that book is a very good one. Thanks for the compliments, guys. Thanks. It's always a pleasure to do these lectures. Let's see, what else? Anything on the Sicilian pin variation? I don't see any questions, so it looks like I did my job. Looks like I covered this lecture, covered the lines all for you guys. If you do have any questions in the future, drop them in the comments section below. We're also always looking for suggestions on what openings to cover. If there's any opening that you want to see done in the future, again, once this video gets published on YouTube, make sure you drop them in the comments section below. I'm always checking them out for ideas. We're going to hop over to Twitch where we're going to do some tactics. I'll see you over there. And if I don't see you on Twitch, I will see you here next week for Openings Explained. Have a good night.